I said to someone earlier, or a couple of people, this 7:30 to 8:30 is not my great hours of the day. This is my dopey hour where I fall asleep on the sofa and then wake up and then think, why did I fall asleep on the sofa? Because it's now going to be gone 1 o'clock before I go to sleep. We're going to continue looking at the book of Mark in the Bible. So on your tables are some little copies of the book of Mark. You can look on your phone as well. And we're going through this and picking out a few kind of stories with this and having a think about it ourselves. And Ben started on the very first week really helpfully kind of helping us to think a little bit differently about how we look at this. And so just want to say out loud, just reminding ourselves that there are no stupid questions. There are no stupid first impressions when you read this. There are no stupid feelings as well. So when we're looking at this, if you've read some of this passage a million times, or whether this is the very first time that you read this passage, I want us to be open to okay, God, you speak to us today. What are you saying to us? And we're going to particularly think about Jesus is grace. And I came across this description, which it says this: grace is like a hug that doesn't let go. And we're going to think a bit more what is grace. And as I was thinking of that, I was remembering about 3.5 years ago, we had the awesomeness of going to the States for a holiday. We'd saved up for about 6 years, it felt like, missed several holidays to go to the States, and my son had just been travelling around Europe for 3 months, and he was just finished A-levels, he was 18, and we hadn't seen him for 3 months. And so the plan was to meet in New York City. Obviously it's a big plan, and it was so it got there. We were texting each other. He was somewhere in the train station, bus station, and we were outside and had no idea where anybody was. And then he appeared and came straight up to me. I'm going already saying this, and we had the most best hug I've ever had in my entire life. I was bawling my eyes out. And I was like, I'm in the middle of New York City. And what made it funny is that both my daughter and son both then spent the whole time going, Dad's going to cry again, he's going to cry. And it was just, for me, I felt like something of a love that had unlocked because I hadn't seen my son for that long. There was something of this deep hug that unlocked a love. And it went beyond awkwardness because it was in the middle of New York City and it's not the kind of thing you normally do. But it went beyond awkwardness. And that was personal to me. Hugs is not for everybody, I get it. But that was a phrase that helped me. But I Googled it, as you do, and the Webster's definition, which is this online dictionary thing, definition of grace, there are 5 definitions. First one is a charming and attractive trait or characteristic. So you carry yourself with grace. Secondly, approval or favour, remain in his good graces. A title of address, your grace. A short prayer at mealtime, you say grace before dinner. Or the top definitions comes closest to what the Bible means by grace. But see if you can understand what this means. Unmerited divine assistance given humans for their regeneration or sanctification. I mean, yeah. That is what the internet's kind of dictionary says grace is. And I'm going to just give a few suggestions what grace might be, and then we're going to look at this Bible passage. Is grace God offering us something that is too good to be true? I like that. God is offering us something too good to be true. Unearned, unmerited, total forgiveness. God's undeserving love for us. We don't deserve it, but he gives his love for us, even in the darkest moments of our lives. In the Bible it says grace, that in John 1:14, a few books in the Bible after the Mark, it says the Word, that is Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Grace is embodied in the person of Jesus. And for me, grace is personal, but grace is for our world too, for our societies. Often I think we just get locked in, it's just me. It's God's undeserved love for me. I don't deserve it. But I think it's for our world too. And before we read this passage, I was thinking about this and reminded of this worship song. Well, I think it's a worship song. That I remember watching it at Glastonbury Festival. I was on the TV. I was watching it on the TV, obviously. I wasn't amongst 100,000 people. But I was watching it on the TV. And I felt, there were 100,000 people who were worshipping God, but didn't realise they were worshipping God. So we're going to watch and just listen to these words, and hopefully some of this will help us and be kind of in the background as we read this passage. So it's not the Glastonbury versions, but it's another version because you can hear the lyrics a little bit better. For those who are a little bit older, that's a guy called Stormzy. If you want to check him out, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, he was at the Brit Awards and kind of testified to his faith in Jesus there from a stage. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on people like that in the entertainment business, etc. But for someone to say, actually, I'm following Jesus and he makes a difference to my life, is a big deal. But so when I say that grace is not just it is a personal thing, but it is for our world and needs to kind of impact our entire world, then yeah, I think music is a way of infiltrating, shall we say. So we're going to look at the book of Mark again, and we're going to look at chapter 5, which is on hopefully the verses, or I think it's page 11 and 12, is it? I haven't written this down. Yeah, 11 and 12. I'm going to read it out. I'm going to save a few quick things, and then we're going to have a think again. That's it. So, Mark 5, verses 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her, so she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his coat, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from suffering. At once, Jesus realised the power had gone out from it, and he turned around to the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So we see a situation here. And I want to have these three questions in your head. Where are we? What's going on? What's happening? And who's there? And just a few kind of background things just before we read the passage again. The synagogue leader, that's the kind of leader of the religious sort of temple, is called Jairus. He pleaded with Jesus to come and heal his daughter. That's not a thing that a synagogue leader would do. A man with reputation, public position, comes to Jesus, and Jesus' response, even to him, is to get up and head to his house, to show grace, to show undeserving favour and love to this guy. That was kind of not expected. Jesus' response was grace and compassion there. And then this woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years, probably a menstrual condition, meant that in that culture she was ceremonially unclean. Back in the Old Testament in the Bible has a million different laws, well, probably not a million, but a lot of laws. And one of them is kind of saying that someone like this woman would have been unclean, described as unclean in that culture, and even touching the edge of Jesus' cloak would have made him unclean. This teacher, this rabbi in that culture would have been unclean because this woman would have touched him. And the picture is expanded because it says, even in this version, it's in a couple versions in the Gospels in the Bible. But it expands the picture by revealing that she was under a great deal of care from doctors, but was getting worse, not better. Yet what we see is this amazing situation where something of Jesus being the one who lives and embodies grace, undeserving love. What that woman felt, she didn't deserve that, but God's love was for her. That changed her. His power came from Jesus. We saw Stormzy, who I would say is a cultural prophet now. A cultural prophet from my era would be a guy called Bono. He's a band called U2, for those who are a lot younger. Like they are now in their 60s, 70s probably. So, but he once said this about grace, which I found quite helpful. This idea called grace turns upside down the narrative: as you reap, so you will sow. Grace defies reason and logic. Love interrupts, if you like, the consequences of your action, which is really good news. I've done a lot of stupid stuff. That's between me and God. But I'd be in a big trouble if karma was going to finally be my judge. I'd be in big trouble. It doesn't excuse my mistakes, but I'm holding out for grace. I'm holding out that Jesus took my sins onto a cross because I know who I am, and I hope I don't have to depend on my own religiousness. The point of the death of Christ is that Christ took all the sins of the world so that what we put out did not come back to us. That our sinful nature does not reap the obvious death. That's the point. It should keep us humbled. It's not by our good works that we get to the gates of heaven. If only I could be more like Jesus, the world would be transformed. All I do is get up on the cross of the ego, where it's about a bad hangover or the bad reviews. But when I look at the cross of Christ, what I see up there is all my bad stuff and everyone else's. So I ask myself a question a lot of people have asked. Who is this man? Jesus. Jesus is grace. God's undeserving love for us and for this world. And as we think about this passage, I'm going to read it again. actually maybe somebody here could read it. And then I'm just going to say two very short things that I think come up for me that I wrestle with, and then we'll have a think together in groups. Does anyone mind reading it again? So from verse 21. Yeah.
When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realised that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering."
Thank you, Alice. So, looking at that passage, Jesus is grace. Jesus' undeserving love for each one of us, whatever situation in life. If I hear that for the first time, I'm like, wow, that is awesome. But I've been a Christian a long time. And two things that have come up in my life and raise up now and again around this. And one is, but what about rules? And the other one is about apathy. When I was brought up, my mum is from Northern Ireland. She's just turned 80 on Monday. She's from Northern Ireland, still sounds like she still lives in Northern Ireland, even though she lived here for 50 years. But she was brought up in a very, very strict religious Christian but Protestant background. And that affected and carried on in my life when we were brought up. So for me, being brought up in a very loving Christian family, I thought it was all about rules. I had to do this right and do this right and do this right and do that, and then I'd be accepted by God. Or I had to do this, and everything was about rules. I totally love my parents to bits, but that was a struggle. Even now, a long time later, now and again those things come up and I think, is God about rules? But what about grace, where it clashes? And I think sometimes we can also take that a little bit further and go the other way and say, well, it's okay, I can do whatever I like because God still loves me totally unconditionally. It doesn't matter what I do because he's undeserved love for me. That's a kind of a, I don't know what you call it, a paradox or a tension. And the other one is about apathy. And perhaps some of us think, actually, I've experienced God's grace before. But stuff happens in lives and people around me, and I get hurt and broken. And I wonder, I get hardened and a bit apathetic and wonder, is God's grace really that amazing that can totally change every situation? How have we been hardened? And I'm saying those things out loud because I want us to have a look at this passage, and there's some questions that we put up each week, just coming on the screen now, to help us think about this passage. But put yourself into this passage. Think about what God's grace is and how that is revealed in Jesus. And maybe if you're kind of like, oh, yeah, I've read this lots of times, okay, whatever. Maybe think about stuff like apathy or the tension between rules and knowing God's undeserved love for us, what that really means. And can we even take God for granted on that? So that's just a few things to throw out there. Doesn't give any answers, sorry, but hopefully to help kind of us journey forward and think. And then we'll just have opportunity to respond, maybe share a few things and respond a little bit later. So just in your little groups, if you're comfortable with that, have a chat with people around you. Don't forget you can help yourself tea, coffee, more cakes as well. But and then we'll just feedback any thoughts from the groups before we kind of have an opportunity just to respond. Okay. Thank you all.